The first thing we have to do is define our terms. What is commonly referred to as a mass shooting doesn't really have a firm definition. However, the FBI defines a mass killing as any incident in which 3 or more people are killed. While this is often used as a stand-in for mass shootings, it is not a perfect fit. If you look into the data for the actual mass killings used to produce these statistics, you will find that many of them are nothing like what you expect when you hear the term mass shooting. Instead, you'll find things like gang violence, someone who kills multiple members of their family at home, a spontaneous crime of passion where the murderer panics and starts killing witnesses, and so on. On the other hand, there are also many events which you would firmly call a mass shooting, but because the shooter was stopped before 3 people were killed, such an event would be excluded from the FBI's mass killing statistics because it did not meet the victim threshold. To solve this issue, the FBI has crafted the term active shooter, which they define as,
Quote, an active shooter is an individual actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a populated area. End quote.
And indeed, in that same 2014 report, the FBI determined that only 40% of such incidents fell within the parameters of the federal definition of mass killing, 3 or more killed. The official numbers and the problem with wounded counts. Here is the raw victim statistics from the FBI. Before we continue, there are 2 important things to understand about that graph. First, 82.7%, 489 out of 591 of that large spike of wounded in 2017 was due to a single anomalous event. The Las Vegas shooting was extremely abnormal and does not represent anywhere close to the average active shooter incident. If you wish to accurately understand this issue, it is very important that you do not assume that such a profound outlier is in any way representative of the norm. Second, as is often the case with this kind of data, the generic wounded count is largely useless because we have no way of knowing how bad those injuries were. The types of injuries which fall into the category of wounded are vastly different from one another and can be anything from trivially minor to life-threatening. So, if the dataset groups all injuries together and doesn't specify the distribution of severity, then we have no way of knowing what those numbers actually mean. As we saw in parts 1 and 2, most of the officially recorded injuries from firearm violence were cuts and bruises. And even most of the severe injuries were things like broken bones and internal injuries, which are a result of the situation, and people tripping and falling over, breaking a finger or an arm, getting trampled, getting shoved into things, etc. Sure, they're important to document and include in the overall harm caused by the event. But if you don't distinguish these specifics, it ends up giving the illusion that all, or even the majority, of those injury totals are gunshot wounds. And while the data is highly ambiguous in the FBI reports, it is clear that they are doing the same thing, at least to some degree. There are several instances where they explicitly state that some of the injuries were not gunshot wounds or were caused by the commotion of the event, but most of the time, they're vague and ambiguous. As an example of the explicitly mentioned exceptions in the FBI report for the active shooter events in 2022, for event number 11, 36th Street Station, Brooklyn, New York, in the casualty section of the summary, it says,
23 people were wounded, 10 by gunfire.
In other words, more than half of the wounded people had nothing to do with guns. Sure, it is harm done in society, and is worth noting. But in a report looking specifically at active shooters, to then say something as vague as 23 people were wounded by a mass shooter, it makes people think that 23 people were shot, when the truth is not even close to that. In fact, a press release by the Department of Justice Office of Public Affairs summarized the injuries of the event like this.
Quote, "In total, 10 victims were struck by the defendant's bullets. Even more passengers suffered from smoke inhalation and other mental and physical injuries due to the defendant's attack." End quote.
What is the line for what counts as wounded to the FBI? Is it breathing in smoke? Or are they only looking at cuts, bruises, and broken bones from the chaos and panic? And what counts as a mental injury? Fear? Anxiety? Distress? PTSD? Nightmares? If they count minor injuries, such as a cut or bruise, like in the violent crime statistics from Part 2, then what is the mental equivalent of such trivial harm? And should that really be included in a serious discussion about the unique danger of active shooters? If there is no way to distinguish such things, then the data is useless. And it's not just those few events where the FBI report admits it. For example, another event in the same 2022 report, event number 16, Gwinnett County School Bus, Suwanee, Georgia, lists the casualties as
1 person was wounded, bus driver and employee.
But, according to the news,
Quote, "Police said no children were injured, but the school bus driver was hit by broken glass when bullets flew through the bus windows." End quote.
So apparently no one was shot, and that one wounded casualty was cuts from broken glass, but there's no indication of how severe those cuts were. If you've ever seen a bullet go through glass, it certainly has some energy behind it. But it's not like a grenade or something. And depending upon the angle and distance from the window, the severity of his injuries could vary wildly. He could have gotten big shards of glass in his eyes, or he could have gotten minor scratches on his arms. We have no way of knowing. That's the problem. But I'm not just making a general argument here. There are similar issues with the wounded count from the Las Vegas shooting. The official report by the Las Vegas Metro Police Department says the following in reference to the number of victims.
Quote, "LVMPD recognizes the approximate 22,000 people who attended the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival are all victims. That number does not take into consideration the hundreds and possibly thousands who were walking along Las Vegas Boulevard outside the Las Vegas Village venue at the time of the shooting. The goal of FIT was to document those who actually sustained any type of physical injury, regardless of the extent or degree. Approximately 869 people sustained documented physical injuries. Of those who sustained injuries, FIT was able to confirm approximately 413 gunshot or shrapnel injury victims. Approximately 360 victims sustained injuries other than gunshot or shrapnel injuries. Approximately 96 people were identified as having sustained an injury, but the type of injury sustained was unable to be confirmed." End quote.
But then, in the footnote for those numbers, they clarify.
Quote, "These numbers reflect data collected through August 2, 2018. Due to the mass number, types of injuries sustained, and subjects who were treated and released prior to police contact, a definitive number of people who sustained gunshot or shrapnel injuries is not known." End quote.
So we have no idea how many of those injuries were actual gunshot wounds, and how many were generic shrapnel injuries, or even if the total is correct. A shrapnel injury could be anything from life-threatening severe damage, all the way down to something akin to small splinters or cuts. And that's the problem. We have no idea how bad these injuries were, nor the distribution of how many were bad and how many were minor. This is why the wounded counts in many genres of statistics are largely useless, because they don't differentiate between serious injuries and trivial ones, just as we saw in the previous article on firearm violence, where 84% of the victims of non-fatal firearm violence were completely unharmed, and of those who were actually injured, 68% of them, that is, 10.74% out of 15.83%, only suffered minor injuries, i.e. bruises or cuts. But when you just say a stat like victims wounded by gun violence, no one is going to think that 68% of them could be solved with a Band-Aid. The FBI active shooter report only counted 489 wounded for the Las Vegas incident. So it's clear that they are excluding some of the LVMPD's injury counts, but it's not clear as to which ones, why, and what severity threshold or documented evidence requirement was the deciding factor. The FBI's number doesn't match any of the numbers in the LA report, nor even any combination of them, not even close. And yet again, this is the problem. Even to the degree that some of these injuries are worth including, they are so ambiguous that we cannot meaningfully compare them to the data for any other statistic, because we can't differentiate the precise truth of the meaning of injuries or wounded. It is at best a useless statistic, and at worst, actively misleading. So, given this understanding, for the rest of this article, we will only be looking at the death counts, because it is the only statistic that is a known objective severity, is consistent, i.e. the same definition is used in different datasets, and is comparable like for like with other statistics. Also, for some statistics, the deaths are the only thing that is recorded, and thus is the only thing we can compare to. The key point to understand with mass shootings is just how amazingly rare they are. If you watch the news, it may seem as if they are happening almost non-stop. But just as we discussed before, you have to put this into the context of just how massive the United States really is. Anything that's possible is going to happen a lot when you have over 300 million people running around. But on the whole, based upon this report by the FBI, it is true that active shooter incidents are slowly increasing over time, and at first glance, dozens upon dozens of active shooter deaths every year seems like a lot. But let's put it into context. The victimization rate of mass shootings is only a tiny fraction of even the firearm homicide rate, which itself is quite rare, as we discussed previously. When put into such context, you can easily see that mass shootings are extremely rare. You're more likely to die from accidentally shooting yourself than from an active shooter. For some more calibrating context, let's revisit the final graphs from Part 2 and add active shooter deaths for comparison. Just to be clear, I did not manipulate that graph. I rendered that graph at a relatively large resolution of 6 inches by 9 inches, and the active shooter bar is still so small that Microsoft Excel literally doesn't even draw it on the bar graph. It does, however, show it on the line graph. Hopefully, this context will give people pause before they get caught up in the emotion of a tragic event and start seeking to change core tenets of our law and founding principles, which have stood for 250 years. And let's go a step further. One of the common claims about active shooters is that it is an epidemic which is rapidly growing every year. As you can clearly see from these graphs, that is not the case. However, to help confirm that for you, I'm going to show you a different death statistic, which actually does fit that description. Every year, infants die from something called accidental suffocation and strangulation in bed, ASSB, which is a specific type of sudden unexpected infant death, SUID, tracked by the CDC. While the overall SUID rate has been going down since 1990, ASSBs have been going up, and they have accelerated drastically since 1998. And for at least the last 24 years, active shooter victims have never even come close to the number of infant deaths from accidental suffocation and strangulation in bed. Why don't we have a national outcry and continuous news coverage and outraged politicians and street protests demanding government action over the thousands of suffocating babies? If the genuine motivation is saving lives, then the preventable body count should be the driving factor, right? So why not? Do people only care about kids dying when the cause is a gun? because the degree of outrage and demands are nowhere near proportional to the harm. And what about the orders of magnitude more kids dying from cars, pools, and accidental suffocation and strangulation that we saw in Part 3? People will argue all day about how no one needs a gun, and they cause so many deaths, especially against kids. But how many of them harbor the same moral condemnation against backyard pools? No one needs a pool, so why not make them illegal? Or morally condemn parents who have one for endangering their kids, the same way they do parents who own guns. Note: the accidental suffocation and strangulation of children under 14 years old from the graph in Part 3 is more than just this infant ASSB count. If you subtract ASSBs from that 2020 under 14 data, the leftover deaths still exceed accidental firearm deaths by 3 times. Even if you restrict it to only look at the 5 to 14-year-old demographic, it's still 71 accidental strangulation or suffocation deaths versus 50 accidental firearm deaths. I want to go back to something we mentioned at the beginning of this article. The 2014 FBI report, which determined that only 40% of active shooter incidents fell within the parameters of the federal definition of mass killing, 3 or more killed. This fact produces an interesting corollary. That means that in 60% of active shooter incidents, there were only 2 or fewer deaths. In fact, when you extend the data through 2023, it gets even more pronounced, with only 35% resulting in 3 or more deaths. Also, in this more precise breakdown of the death counts, you can also see that in 28% of active shooter events, there were 0 deaths. Now, to be clear, that doesn't necessarily mean there were no injuries at all, but again, injuries are too ambiguous to compare. Another thing to be aware of is that active shooter incidents are not uniformly distributed around the country. And more importantly, the distribution does not favor states with harsh gun laws. For example, California, widely considered to have the strictest gun laws in the U.S., had the #1 most instances of active shooter events over the last 24 years in terms of raw totals, 64 incidents, 49% more than the #2 state, Texas, at 43 incidents. Meanwhile, 3 other states, Montana, Rhode Island, and Wyoming, did not have a single one. And 3 more states, Alaska, Iowa, and West Virginia, did have at least 1 active shooter incident, but have never had a death from one. However, given how drastically states vary in population size, it's not fair to compare them without taking the population differences into account. When we normalize for population and convert the numbers into per 1 million people, we get this. This is the number of active shooter incidents per 1 million people by state. And here are the number of deaths from active shooters per 1 million people by state. Try this for a minute. Remove the politics from the question and think about active shooter events as if it was an illness or a brand of car. Yes, it injures people and it kills people, but over the last 24 years, it has only killed 1,409 people in a population of 330 million. Automobile accidents kill 30 times that amount every single year. 1 year's worth of car accidents kills 30 times more people than a quarter-century of active shooters. For another comparison, over that 24-year period, drunk driving killed 283,390 people, while active shooters only killed 1,409. If there were a hypothetical country which had the exact same rate of active shooters as the U.S., but only had a population of 1 million people, then over that same 24-year time period, active shooters would have only killed roughly 4 people. Obviously, if it happens to you or someone you care about, then it is a terrible thing that will affect you for the rest of your life. Of course, I completely agree. However, the same is true for many things, such as deaths or severe trauma from drunk driving or suicide, or the loss of a young child due to an accidental suffocation or drowning, etc. Life is full of horrible, tragic events, but you cannot lose sight of the fact that these tragedies must be put into their proper context. You cannot let your emotional response cloud your judgment on issues regarding permanent changes to federal law. And just to finish things up, let's give one more stat to put that into one final bit of further context. Those 1,409 deaths are the sum total over a 24-year period. We can average that out into a uniform statistic. 1,409 divided by 24 equals 58.71. So that comes to an average of 59 deaths per year for over 2 decades. According to the CDC,
quote, on average, 28 people in the United States die each year from lightning strikes, according to all U.S. lightning deaths reported from 2006 through 2021, end quote.
And before you counter that active shooters also injure many more than they kill, so does lightning. According to the U.S. National Weather Service,
quote, lightning kills about 20 people each year in the United States, and hundreds more are injured. Some survivors suffer lifelong neurological damage, end quote.
Active shooters kill an average of 59 people per year, and lightning kills 28 people per year. So, active shooters are only twice as deadly as lightning strikes. Your risk of being killed by an active shooter is only double that of being killed by lightning. So, relatively speaking, compared to all the other dangers in life that are orders of magnitude more prevalent, being killed by an active shooter is literally on par with being struck by lightning. How many gun control activists are worried about being struck by lightning? Think about how different our culture would be, and how scared people would be of lightning if there was continuous nationwide news coverage every time someone was killed or injured by lightning. Remember, hundreds of people in the U.S. are killed or injured by lightning strikes every single year, but there are only 52 weeks in a year. That means that, on average, multiple people are killed or injured by lightning every week in the U.S. Imagine if multiple times per week, every week, all year long, you saw nationwide news stories about yet another person getting struck by lightning. Think about how much panic and fear there would be in the general public about getting struck by lightning. Think about how many people would be proclaiming that you shouldn't let your children play outside because it's too dangerous. Imagine all the people demanding that the government install lightning rods all over the country to keep us safe, etc. Or perhaps more realistically, and more beneficially, imagine how different our society would be if the news gave equivalent coverage to the deaths from drunk driving and directed people's concern to where it really might make a difference. How many people would still be alive? As always, for this article's sources, more articles, or to get a copy of the book, visit weepingdragon.com.